All right, let's bow our heads. Father in heaven, thank you so much for the holiday that we have just had, and as we head into a season that can be busy and stressful, I pray that you would give peace to our hearts and generosity in our lives. Be with us right now, clear away any distractions, and may we learn and be inspired by what we're going to talk about today. I pray this all in your name. Amen. Jesus said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." I'm going to do something very different for our sermon today. This is something that I have never done before. I hope that you will find it interesting and inspiring. We've ended our series in the wilderness, and it didn't feel like quite the right time to start talking about the Christmas story. So I'm taking this Sabbath as a wild card week to share with you about a piece of Adventist history. We are going to walk through the lives of two remarkable women who spent their lives as missionaries. Now, some of you are going to be wondering, where is my Bible study for the week? We'll get back to that eventually, but I think that there's real value to what we're going to talk about today. That the Bible is the record of how God has worked in history, and I believe that that same God has continued to work in history. And what we're going to talk about today is just one example of how Jesus' call to go into all the world was accomplished. We're going to go back today about 100 years to the country of Korea, early 1900s. At the time, there was no division of North and South Korea. There was just one unified country that was known to the world either as Korea or by its Japanese name, Chosun. So my sermon title, Chosen Sisters, is a little play on words that I think is very clever. Korea's Seventh-day Adventist history can be traced all the way back to the missionary efforts of two dedicated women, Mimi Scharfenberg and Theodora Wengeren. These women were sisters, and in a surprising chain of events, they would end up living and serving in Korea for most of their adult lives. Now, there were other key Adventist missionaries in Korean history, but Mimi and Theodora were significant in ministering to and teaching the women of this region. At the time, you see, Korean women were often left uneducated and secluded. They were responsible for running the home almost single-handedly, which made it very difficult to share the gospel with the mothers and daughters of the country. Mimi herself observed the stark gender roles. She wrote, "The women over in Korea are more used to hard work than men are. The men, as a rule, play the gentleman. And that means you must not work enough to sweat, that you must not dirty your clothes. And so, the hardest work always falls on the women." Now, Mimi did not intend this, but that last line almost feels autobiographical. As we're going to see, she and Theodora worked tirelessly for years, facing personal and cultural challenges that the men on the mission field could never fathom. And their lives and their faith, their perseverance, left a legacy that touched thousands of lives for Christ. So, we're going to get to them eventually, but we got to rewind a bit and set the scene. The Adventist message first spread to Korea in 1904. One of the first Japanese Seventh-day Adventist ministers was this man here, Hide Kuniya. Kuniya was helping out with evangelistic meetings in Japan when he noticed a man come into the meetings who was carrying a Chinese Bible. Kuniya went over and spoke with the man, but he was Korean. His name was Eung-hyun Lee. Well, Lee did not speak Japanese, but the two of them were able to communicate using Chinese characters. Now, Lee, the Korean man, he was very excited about what he was hearing, so he brought another Korean friend of his to the meetings following. His friend's name was Song-hyun Cho, and long story short, Lee and Cho were baptized in Japan, and they were excited to share these new truths with other people. Well, Lee was in Japan because he was going to catch a ship to Hawaii, but his friend Cho was actually returning to Korea, where he was from. And his conversion, turned out, was no fluke. In fact, just on the boat ride home, he met another Korean Christian that he introduced to the Adventist faith. And the two of them went back to Korea when they landed, and they began to share about these new things with their neighbors and their friends. And in just a few weeks, there were nearly 40 people who had accepted this Adventist message. Well, these new believers requested help from the church to meet this growing demand. Now, at this point, Adventism had no presence in the country to be able to meet this growing interest. So the first people that they were able to send were actually from Japan. They sent F.W. Field, who was the director of the Japan mission, and they sent Kuniya, who was the first pastor to connect with these men. So the two of them worked up in the northern part of the country. They kind of struggled because the Korean locals didn't understand their Japanese. And Cho, the man that he helped to convert, began working in the southern part of the country. And Cho worked as hard as he could. However, he really wanted and needed the help of seasoned missionaries. By the next year, the first American Adventist missionaries had showed up in the country, William and Addie Smith. They learned the language, they established the first official church, and at first, the greater and more immediate need in the country was for schooling and medicine. Well, Elder Smith took it upon himself to tackle the medicine portion of things, and he prayed that God would send somebody who would meet the educational needs of the people. Well, his prayer was answered in the arrival of a most unlikely missionary. Mimi Scharfenberg was the oldest of 8 brothers and sisters, so she knew something of what it was like to be independent. She was baptized a Seventh-day Adventist at 18 after attending evangelistic meetings with her mother in Wisconsin. And after that, she enrolled in Battle Creek College, which is today, anybody know? Andrews University, very good. She was eager to do full-time work spreading the gospel. And the first thing that she tried to do was colporteuring. Colporteuring, if you don't know, is where you go door to door and you sell religious books. She wasn't great at that, but she did really enjoy following up on Bible study requests with people. And soon that became her full-time work. Now, during this time, Mimi met a nice young man. This man was a minister of another denomination, and he would come with Mimi on her Bible studies, and he was always very interested in Mimi's beliefs. Well, eventually it got to the point where he asked Mimi to marry him. Now, this was an attractive offer, especially for Mimi, who was in her early 20s at this point. However, this man wanted to get married first and then become baptized as an Adventist. And for Mimi, this was a red flag, so she broke off the relationship. Now, this breakup left her very confused about her future. What exactly was she supposed to be doing with her life? Well, it was not long after that she had a dream. In her dream, she saw a group of women, each dressed in these odd white gowns. These women were standing on the other side of a body of water, and their arms were outstretched, calling for Mimi to come to them. She woke up very confused. Who were these women? What did this mean? Well, later that morning, still confused by this dream, Mimi received a letter delivered from the Secretary of the General Conference inviting her to serve as a missionary in Korea. Now, this is a pre-internet, pre-television world, so we can forgive Mimi for not knowing what or where Korea was. So she went to the library and began looking through books, looked up Korea in different encyclopedias, and she was shocked to discover pictures of women that looked exactly like the women in her dream. Mimi felt that this was confirmation that God was leading her to accept this call to mission work. So in November 1906, Mimi left Wisconsin and made the long voyage all the way to her new mission field. And on New Year's Day, 1907, she arrived in Korea, where she met F.W. Field and the Smith family. Mimi was single, she was 23 years old, and she was now living in a foreign country. But she was not afraid of this new responsibility that she had been given or this new place. She believed that God had led her here. As one person wrote about her life, upon her arrival there, she saw her dream in living characters, the women of Korea. Now, when Mimi showed up, she was forced to learn the language very quickly. She would spend 2 to 3 hours every day studying Korean with one of the local converts, and then she'd spend 2 to 3 more hours just on her own practicing the language. Mimi wrote this during her first months in the country: "My whole desire is that I may be able to learn the language so I shall be able to tell them of the love of Jesus." At the end of 1907, after learning the language, her first responsibility was to start a school for girls. And she did. She established a school, and she very much enjoyed working in the classroom with these girls, but she longed to share the gospel with the adult women of Korea. She saw a real need there. You see, illiteracy was common among women at the time, which made it difficult for the gospel message and the Adventist message to be interesting to them. And compounding the problem was how the women saw themselves. Mimi noticed this when she first arrived. Groups of women would come up to her and ask her questions, and they would always want to know if she had any older brothers. They would never ask if she had any sisters, because to them, girls were of no account. A woman's role in Korea at the time was to basically be a servant for her father or her husband, doing all of the physical labor in the home and in the fields. Women had no agency, and they very often were not permitted any education. Listen to Mimi describe the effect that this had. "It's a hard matter to reach these Korean women with the message because they believe that they are beyond the hope of salvation. One woman said to me, 'Do you think I can be saved? My husband tells me I have no soul and I'm not worth saving. He says it's useless for me to come to these meetings.' But as soon as these women learn that the love of God is freely given to all alike, they are so thankful and they become faithful converts." So Mimi was fueled by the inequality that she saw, and she made it her focus to reach these women. So her first goal was to empower the women with the ability to read and write. At first, she would just meet with the adult women in her home, where she would teach them how to read the way that she would teach a little child how to read. And she would have women that would gather in her home from 7 in the morning all the way until 10 at night. Well, eventually, this in-home training merged with her work at the school, and her school grew to accept students from ages 8 all the way to 60. Now, Mimi was not a teacher by trade, so she very much struggled with this. This was well out of her comfort zone. She prayed that God would send somebody who was an experienced teacher. What Mimi really wanted to do, and what she got many opportunities to do, was to share about Jesus with these women. She actually had a better capacity to be able to do this, because it was considered improper for male missionaries to speak face-to-face with the Korean women. Mimi could speak directly to them. She wrote in mission reports frequently about the need for Sabbath school teachers for the women. At the time, men and women would meet for Sabbath school in separate rooms. And if they did meet in the same room, there was a curtain drawn between them. And when a man tried to teach the women, he would never get any responses out of them. So Mimi, in order to solve this problem, she hosted women's retreats where she would train 1 or 2 women from each of the different areas who could then go back and lead out Sabbath school for their local group. Now, her work was not limited to just teaching women. Because she was one of the first missionaries who was fluent in the language, she became the first Sabbath school secretary for Korea, which means that she prepared and translated all of the lessons, and she also trained the different officers and teachers. She was also elected the Secretary of Education for the newly formed Korea mission. And then in 1909, she would move to Seoul, where she would become the editor for the what would later become Korea's version of the Signs of the Times, which is an Adventist periodical. Now, her translation projects would grow even larger than this, but while she did that, she never lost her heart for teaching. She actually began a home study course for women who wanted to learn to read and write, but who couldn't attend the school. The way it would work is lessons would get delivered by somebody to the woman's home, and they would be read aloud to the woman, and the woman would then fill out the lesson and send it back in the mail. And she had 147 women enrolled in this home study course. Mimi absolutely loved what she did. I cannot express how thankful I am that the Lord has called me to this field. I enjoy my work better the longer that I remain. Now, at this point, she and the Smith family were the only American workers with a knowledge of the language. And the local ministers, they weren't well equipped for the demanding work. Well, in 1909, Smith returned to the General Conference to accept a position there, which left Mimi as the only American missionary left in the field who spoke the language. She needed help. So she prayed, and she believed that another missionary would arrive. She never expected, however, that this call for help would be accepted by, of all people, her sister. So let's talk about Theodora. Unfortunately, I could not find a younger picture of her that was good quality at all. So this is her obviously much later in life because she's younger than Mimi is. But her story actually begins when she is a young adult. Theodora was a Bible worker in Wisconsin who began a relationship with another Bible worker named Rufus Wangerin. Rufus and Theodora were set to be married that summer, 1909, when Rufus received a call to serve as a missionary in Korea. Now, wouldn't you know it, Theodora had been hearing updates from her sister Mimi, who was in Korea, and the opportunity just seemed undeniable. So, that fall, the newlywed Wangerins spent their postponed honeymoon aboard a ship traveling to their new home in Korea. Theodora was only 20 years old, and though she did not know it at the time, she was 2 months pregnant as well. Rufus and Theodora arrived in October 1909, and they were stationed to work at the mission headquarters in Seoul. There was about 150 Adventists in the region at the time. The Wangerins worked with Mimi at first to establish the first Adventist church in Seoul, and this was while they were trying to learn the difficult new language. And after the birth of their first daughter, the Wangerins were relocated to the rural area of Kazan to the south. And Kazan had no Christian influence whatsoever. And they had to do it all there. Their work was medical, educational, and spiritual all at the same time. And they had 2 more children during that time because there wasn't enough going on. Now, one of Theodora's most lasting contributions was her writing. She would frequently publish stories in mission magazines and Adventist periodicals to recruit support for the mission work in Korea. Here's one example. In a Signs of a Times article, she tells the story of a 9-year-old girl who committed to follow Jesus just moments before dying of sickness. And she ends the article like this: "This is only one of the precious little jewels from Korea whom you may meet in the kingdom. There are many, many more. Will you not help us to find them?" So throughout her writing, Theodora invited the wider Adventist world into the joy of her mission experience. She placed the believers in Korea into the hearts and minds of those around the world. Now, fast forward a little bit. In 1915, a group of church leaders came to visit the missionaries in Korea. And among those Adventist leaders was the General Conference President, A.G. Daniels. The group of them climbed a nearby mountain and they looked out over the villages in Korea, and they prayed that God would send more missionaries to help. Daniels noted that the missionary work in Korea was in a very fragile position. The Wangerins were the only American workers in the southern part of the country, and it was a region that had 6 million people in it. Daniels wrote this in his report of the travel: "Should either of them fail in health and they be compelled to leave the field, we should surely sustain great loss while waiting for someone to take up this work." Well, this fear would soon become a reality. Right when their third daughter was born in 1915, Rufus contracted a hacking cough. The mission doctor made some suggestions, and the cough went away. But later that following spring, after a trip to a Korean island, Rufus returned with the same illness. This time they went to the hospital for a diagnosis, and they found it was tuberculosis. Now, the mortality rate of tuberculosis in the early 1900s was dropping a little bit, but it was still one of the deadliest diseases in the world at that time. The Wangerins were advised to return home immediately. But feeling that there was no one to replace him in the work and believing that there was still much yet to do, Rufus decided to return to his mission work with no intention to leave the field. Well, he wasn't the only one who became sick. As he fought his own illness, his youngest child, baby Mabel, became sick as well. They took Mabel in, but the mission hospital couldn't find anything wrong, so they sent her home. But that same night, Mabel grew even worse, and Theodora raced her to the hospital, where the same doctor examined her more closely and acknowledged that indeed, Mabel was indeed very sick. They spent the night in the hospital, but the mission doctor confirmed the next morning that Mabel didn't have much longer to live. Rufus and Theodora took their daughter home to Kazan, where she died the following day. Rufus and Theodora buried their baby daughter on a hillside there. Rufus wrote this: "That little missionary grave on old Kazan Hill endears Korea and its people to our hearts only that much more." Theodora remembers the promise that Christ, who is the resurrection and the life, shall cause the dead in him to arise in that resurrection morning, was very precious to us in that hour. Barely a month later, Rufus was forced to return to the United States with his family for his own health. He wanted very badly to stay. The family traveled to Colorado, where they were hopeful that he would soon recover, but he didn't. Rufus died at age 33 on June 10, 1917. And Theodora remembers his parting words to his two daughters: "Good night, my little sweethearts. I'll see you in the morning." Now, I'll just pause here for a moment. I know that this story has taken a very depressing turn. My goal this morning is not to bum you out. I don't know if you're struck by the way that Rufus and Theodora spoke about death. They refused to believe that death was the end. They felt deeply the pain of life being cut short. As you've maybe heard me say before, hurting with hope still hurts. But they recognized that that hurt is not the end of the story. Death does not get the last word over God's people because a resurrection is coming. There's some of you who've heard me share this illustration before. It's like going to the eye doctor and getting your pupils dilated. It's one of my least favorite parts of getting my eyes checked because I'm very fussy with eye drops. When your eyes are dilated, not only are you more sensitive to light, but you also struggle to focus on things that are close. Like you'll pull out your phone, but you can't see it, so you have to hold it way out here in order to be able to see your phone. Things that are close become blurry, and things that are far away become clear. Rufus and Theodora had dilated eyes, so to speak. The pain that was close became blurry, and what was far off became clear. This is what it means to grieve with hope. Heartache and loss will happen in this life, and it will hurt. But the hope of Jesus can blur that hurt in light of things that are yet to come. Now, the story does not end here. Theodora grieved these losses deeply, but her heart still felt pulled back to Korea. So she requested to be able to return to be with Mimi. The General Conference sent her a letter. "Although we have never sent a young widow with 2 little children," Theodora was 28 when she became a widow. "Although we've never sent a young widow with 2 little children to the mission field, we believe that in your case, as you and your sister plan to make a home together, it will work out satisfactorily. So in December 1917, 6 months after Rufus's death, Theodora and her 2 children returned to Korea, and she was excited to work with Mimi. However, when she returned, she discovered that her sister had become ill. Mimi had contracted tuberculosis and dysentery. The sisters cared for one another during this challenging time, and they both tried to continue doing mission work despite the difficulties. But it was not long before Mimi, like Rufus, had to be sent home to the United States for her health. Now, Mimi's missionary spirit never stopped. In fact, on that boat ride home, despite being very, very ill, she met another woman who was interested in studying the Bible. And Mimi conducted Bible studies with her, and as a result of that encounter, the woman accepted the Adventist message and she became a Bible teacher herself. When Mimi arrived in America, she spent one day at home and then had to be taken to the hospital. And her mother arrived at Mimi's bedside an hour after her death. It had been 10 years of missionary work, and within just 2.5 years, Theodora had lost a daughter, a husband, and a sister. But these losses did not cause her to give up. In fact, these trials committed her all the more to work in Korea. She would spend the next 33 years of her life living among her second family. I want to end by telling you something amazing about how this story actually began. In 1901, in the city of Milwaukee, a series of Adventist Bible lectures was being held for the community. And among those in attendance was a teenage girl and her mother. These 2 women were very receptive to this message about the Sabbath and the soon return of Jesus. 3 months later, the mother and her daughter, Mimi, were baptized into the Adventist church. And get this, they were the only people to accept the message as a result of that evangelistic effort. Some of the most significant years of missionary work in Korea can be traced back to the disappointing response of a, quote, failed evangelistic effort. Mimi's literacy programs inspired hundreds of women to read the Bible for themselves and believe that the hope in its pages applied to them. Her work in translating and publishing allowed the Adventist message to spread far beyond what the few stationed missionaries could accomplish on their own. Theodora worked in the mission field until 1952, writing, teaching, supervising, sharing about Jesus. And even after retiring, she would continue to write about her experiences so that other people would be inspired to follow in the footsteps of her family. These 2 sisters labored faithfully for decades. And unlike many other women during this time, their contributions cannot be footnoted or co-authored by other men because much of their work was spent on their own. Now, to you and me, their lives might seem incredibly lonely. But neither Mimi nor Theodora ever felt that they were alone. Not just because they believed God was with them, but also because they spent their lives surrounded by people that they loved. The women of Korea, their chosen sisters. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." Father in heaven, we believe that you are a good God and you have given us good news to share. I pray that in whatever capacity is possible, you would give us a spirit of mission to share that with others. We pray this in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen.